Good morning, everyone. Welcome to 21st Century Philippines and World Literature. We are already at our 14th week, and for week 14, our topic is about the literature of the world. So we will start off the history of uh, the literature, how it started, and from the first period until the present time. So we have here the cultural perspective of the 21st century literature. So literary through ages. So we have the ancient literature. So it began with simple words, of course, rhythmic sounds that might or might have meanings, and lullaby songs, religious chants or hymns. Also praises for heroes, gods, and goddesses. These are considered as a literary art or form, and they were closely connected with religion and public life, drawing subjects and characters from the myths. So it all started from the ancient literature. Whatever form of simple word is already part of the literature. So we have here also Middle Kingdom of Egypt. So for us to furthermore understand about the history of literature or the literature of the world, I will show you a video that I will be presenting in our discussion. So, in order for us to further understand the history of literature, so let's proceed to our video. We have here the literary period. So, I will just post the video link for this one for our literary period video link.
Welcome to Mr. Bystrom Flips and this video on the major literary periods in the shaping of our contemporary English literature. I'm trying to give you an overview so that when you study a text you can quickly go and contextualize that by placing it in the appropriate literary period and thereby understand where it fits within the whole English canon and the development of English writing. So I would argue there are two major forces that shape the thinking in literary theory throughout the ages. On the one hand, down the bottom of the page, you have nature, beauty, subjectivity, and emotion. These are really strong values during the classical era, but predominantly during the Renaissance and the Romanticist era of the 1800s. And you'll see that as we get through those parts in the video. On the other hand, at the top of the page, you have reason, logic, structure, objectivity, scientific approaches to writing and to literature, which is much more prominent in particular the classicist Enlightenment thinking, but also in modernism and to some extent in the Victorian and medieval period as well. So we'll see those forces pulling one way or the other in most literary periods. Obviously, when we come to the end here and postmodernism, you'll see that the thinking has kind of been turned on its head, and no one really knows what's up or down or right or wrong anymore, and therefore I'll put that in the middle and turn that sort of squiggly line because no one really knows where the thinking is going in the postmodern era. But we'll come back to that at the end of this video. I might have to break this video into two segments because it is going to be quite a lengthy video because I'm covering 4,500 years in the span of one video. So let's start by examining the classical writing from the ancient period. There is writing from as early as 2600 BC, but this Egyptian papyrus writing is maybe not what we would call a literary nature today, but more historical and documentary. So I think the first literary text as such would be the Gilgamesh epic from about 2000 BC, set in what's today Iran, dealing with the adventures of King Gilgamesh. And I think that sets the tone for this era to some extent because we're dealing with oral traditions of hero stories of people who are gods or kings or combinations thereof. And we see in the Odyssey, we see the exploits of Odysseus and of the kings and princes around Troy and Greece and how they fight for power and to preserve their family or preserve their powers or preserve their sanity in some cases. Excuse me. And so these myths are definitely part of shaping of these myths as part of this period, as well as obviously we're building the foundations for religious thinking in the writings of texts like the Bhagavad Gita and the Bible and the Torah, which are all coming out of this time period. If you were attentive on the previous slide, you will have noticed that from the end of this classical period until what we would call the medieval period, there is a bit of a 500-year gap there, which is primarily there because the literacy levels were so low that really there's very little writing preserved, very little was written at all during that era. Whereas obviously about 500 we start getting monasteries, etc., where people are educated and they start to write things down. So we'll see there's a little bit of a gap before we move into the medieval period on the next slide. So as we move into the period that we would call the medieval period, which stretches roughly from 500 to about 1500, we start seeing more extensive writing and more maybe what we would consider traditional writing today. Most of the writing at the time obviously was in Latin because the educated people who were able to write were predominantly priests and monks who were trained in Latin. And so therefore they're also often centered on Christian morality and the chivalry code with the whole crusades and those sort of writing. But we do have the budding of Old English and Middle English prose in here as well, with the story of Beowulf from somewhere around 900 to 1000. And then in Italy we start getting some budding, more romantic, not in the sense of the era of Romanticism, but more love-centered text in the Petrarchan songs in the Canzoniere, but also in the biblical stories or biblical allegory, I'd like to call the Divine Comedy of Dante, and then we have some meta narratives with the Decamerone and the Canterbury Tales that kind of come out of this era as well. So next up in our little journey, we move to the Renaissance period. I've set the date for the Renaissance period for 1550, which is somewhat inaccurate, but that is, I guess, when most of the seminal texts start to be produced during this era. But more accurately, the start of the Renaissance really comes from two major influences. One was the invention by Johannes Gutenberg of the printing press, which meant that we could print a lot more books because books were no longer just handwritten, and so you could produce much more text, which meant people could read them. And also to the fact that we, with the Reformation of the Catholic Church into Protestantism, people started to speak and read and write about religion in their own language. So in our case, English, the Bible was translated into English, and therefore people were able to read it, even if you hadn't been educated in Latin. And that so those two forces together kind of led to this explosion of literary production, if you like. So the classical excuse me. So the word Renaissance comes out of the word re and ne. So again born. So the rebirth of the classical period. So the ideas, the myths, and the heroes from the classical period are coming back to us, as well as the unities that Aristotle described in his book Poetics, where he talks about the unity of time, the unity of place, and the unity of action. Those become really important in terms of constructing narratives, and writers are really trying to adhere to those traditional ways of writing. Expression became much more free because we were now trying to investigate new ways of writing, which led to a range of particularly drama coming out of this era with Shakespeare and Marlowe, etc., but also expression in terms of poetry with the metaphysics like Donne and Herbert, and eventually in Spain we have the birth of the novel as well, with Don Quixote, considered the first modern novel, I guess, in 1605. So following the Renaissance period, we have a period of neoclassicism. Now the date again is a bit loose here. Some people would argue that the neoclassicist era really starts with Descartes, when René Descartes said cognito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Others would argue that the writing of Isaac Newton's Principia in 1687 would be the start of the period. But Descartes 1637 or Newton 1687 somewhere in the middle there is probably the true start of classicism. But they're both scientific thinkers, and they're both seeing that we can use science to help understand nature better. So this era, also called, most, if we think of it more scientifically into other fields, we call it the Age of Enlightenment. This is when all the big academies are born, a lot of scientific discoveries, etc. In England, we have the Restoration period as well, which I'm not going to go into today. But generally, we have a society that's much more about order and accuracy and structure, and trying to understand the world through science. So, and in that science, people are also able to find a sense of religious solace. So by finding a natural order in the world, people felt spiritually at ease as well. Obviously, during this era, we also have a lot of exploration continuing from the previous period, but people are going off to explore previously unknown parts of the world. So next off, we move on to the Romanticist era. So again, with the timing here, some would say that Romanticism came out of the era of revolutions, with the American War of Independence, as well as the French Revolution in the 1789. But I think the kind of the real kickstart to the Romanticist era would be the publication of lyrical ballads by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. In the preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth says that writing is really about expressing, or is really about a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion, and how essentially in quiet meditation we can recall those moments of intense emotional experiences. And so that's kind of what the Romanticists are searching for. And they're exploring how nature is mysterious, so quite the opposite of the way the people of the Enlightenment were trying to illustrate how through science we could explain everything in nature. The Romanticists were saying, no, it's all very mysterious and difficult to understand. People became aware of their own mortality and about the constant change in society and how we couldn't pin down reality. The imagination, as I said, was very important, because they sat down and reflected upon those intense experiences they had previously had. And the search for the sublime, you see in these two landscape drawings that I've included, how man is kind of searching for these experiences where he feels little and really finds the sense of awesomeness in nature. True beauty and a personal exchange with that beauty and the natural experience and the emotion that brings is really crucial to this. And with that comes eventually the Gothic period and the intense emotional experiences that we find in the supernatural elements in Poe's short stories, in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, in Bram Stoker's Dracula, in Jane Eyre, in Wuthering Heights, etc., etc. Those kind of Gothic and frightening horror stories, if you like. This next period is really contained to just Great Britain or even to England, I would say, because the Victorian era is really about the era under the reign, the rule of Queen Victoria. She was queen from 1837 to 1901. But within the Victorian era, we have kind of two conflicting ideas, if you like, or not conflicting necessarily, but two parallel ideas. On the one hand, there's the exploration, the realistic exploration of the working class situation and the urbanization and what industrialization has done to people generally. So we get that in stories like all the novels of Charles Dickens, David Copperfield, Oliver Twist, Great Expectations. They're all exploring what it's like for the working class people in urbanized cities. And on the other hand, we have these stories about respectability, where people are kind of concealing their true natures within facades of being perfectly respectable. So there's a lot of tension there between what people feel on the inside and what they can actually show on the outside. And we get those kind of things explored, for instance, in the novels of Thomas Hardy, but also in some of the French symbolist poetry that comes out of that same emotion comes in. They're trying to contain emotion and how that kind of bubbles out on the outside. We then move into the era of modernism, which stretches roughly from the end of Victoria's reign until the Second World War, or even up to, I guess, the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima. In this period, we're dealing with a rejection of the past. So the early modernists would be looking back at the Romanticists, and maybe even more at the neoclassics and the Enlightenment thinkers, and rejecting the way that they view the world. In that they were also trying to use practical scientific experimentation to see if they can find new ways to explain the world and new ways to kind of examine the world. And we see this in art, like Picasso's, where he's trying to represent elements of humanity, but in new ways. So we see it in Ezra Pound's both his poetic writing, but maybe more in his essays and his thinking on these issues. And obviously we have changes in psychology with Freud and psychoanalysis. But in the middle of this period, obviously, is we have the First World War, 1914 to 1918, which really led to further rejection of the past with a great sense of nihilism and kind of meaninglessness in the world. And people were starting to even more look at what had been and what was it truly like to be human, in a sense. And this was questioned even more as we move into our next period. Because in 1945, there's really two major things that challenged traditional thinking up to that point. On the one hand, there was the inhumane treatment of everyone in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. Because traditionally, if we look back historically, Germany, along with England and America and France, had been seen as the good guys, the people who were rational, who were logical, who were the advanced people in scientific thinking. And now suddenly, with this incarceration and torture of millions of people, the good guy had become the ultimate bad guy. And on top of that, in 1945, with the US also up to this point seen as a humanitarian and a good guy, dropping 2 bombs on civilian cities and eradicating such enormous quantities of people in Japan, was also now really questioned and seeing what happened now, where these two great nations suddenly became murderers. And this kind of led to this sense of disillusionment with the traditional meta-narrative. Could the good guy be the bad guy? Or really should the woodsman kill Red Riding Hood instead of killing the big bad wolf? Or should the knight go off and marry the dragon instead of marrying the princess? And we kind of started to question the whole idea of the meta-narrative. Who is good and who is bad? And is there anymore a single truth to be had? Which means that writing and art that comes out of this period is much more about parody and pastiche and trying to make fun of things that have been in the past. And really not trying to examine the world as such anymore, because the world doesn't offer answers. So instead trying to challenge it by creating metafictional writings where the narrator is no longer reliable, and we're skipping in chronology, and things are broken up and confusing. We're crossing as many boundaries as we can. And we see that there's no real sort of this is the way a postmodern narrative looks, but rather we have such a plethora of styles of writing, but they are all playing with and challenging the narratives of their past. So the end of the postmodern era is debated. Some people would say that we're still living in a postmodern world, and I'm not necessarily disputing that. But traditionally, we would say, I think, that with the knocking down of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the world was somewhat healed, or at least the scars of World War II were kind of destroyed, and therefore we moved into some sort of new epoch. But I don't think we can say that this new epoch is really labeled in any way yet. I'm going to call it the postmodernism. Because it's not really clear where we're heading next. And obviously, if we look back at all these periods I've covered in this video, at the time, they didn't say, oh, I live in the medieval period. It's something that we have labeled it in hindsight, when we've been able to look back and examine the changes in ideas and the ways of thinking. where the world is right now and where we're heading is very hard to put our finger on, I think. We can definitely see there's an increased fear and confusion in the world post 2001. So I guess you could say that that also was a significant shift with the Twin Towers on 9/11. But we're also living in a world of increased nationalism. So we're kind of heading back in that way, in a sense, to 1930s again, where natural boundaries are getting maybe stronger in some cases, in some parts of the world. And to identify today which are the seminal texts of our era is also very hard to do when we're not really clear on what is the current dominant ways of thinking. But I hope this video has given you a bit of an idea about the streams back and forth in thinking and in influences of the literary period. Any questions or comments, please post those below or send me a message, and I'm happy to engage in further videos with those comments. Thanks very much.
Of a time in which literature shared intellectual, linguistic, religious, and artistic influences. Our literature in every part of the world evolved and became much more sophisticated. Today, we're going to talk about these 8 periods of literature. Let's start first from the very beginning, the ancient period. The ancient Egyptian literature was written in the Egyptian language, from ancient Egypt's pharaonic period until the end of the Roman domination. Along with Sumerian literature, it is considered as the world's earliest literature. Its collections include wise sayings, truth observations, and good counsel. Babylonia and Assyria. Drawing on the traditions of Sumerian literature, the Babylonians compiled a substantial textual tradition of mythological narrative, legal texts, scientific works, letters, and other literary forms. Greece. Archaic. The Greeks created poetry before they made use of writing for literary purposes. And from the beginning, their poetry was intended to be sung or recited. Classical. Great poets live up to this stage like Aristophanes, the greatest of the comedic poets. Pindar, the greatest of the Greek choral lyrics. The works of Plato and Aristotle of the 4th century are the most important of all the products of Greek culture and intellectual history of the West. Hellenistic and Greco-Roman. This time, great writers were conscious of belonging to a world of which Rome was the center. China. In China, Confucius edited the Book of History and composed the Spring and Autumn Annals. The 5 classics exist at this period, which became the component stones in China's true Great Wall against barbarism. Rome. The famous epic poet called the father of literature named Ennius was admitted during this time. Its most famous type of literature is poetry. The 3 most famous Roman poets are Virgil, Horace, and Ovid. Virgil is known for writing the epic poem, the Aeneid. Most of Roman literature was influenced and inspired by Greek literature. India. In India, Rig Veda is the oldest of the sacred books of Hinduism, composed in an ancient form of Sanskrit about 15,000 BC. The most well-known great epics was introduced during this time, namely Mahabharata and Ramayana, the embodiment of the social religious ideals of millions of people of India, known as Hindus. The Quran, which is a collection of Muslim tradition, and the biographies of Muhammad, was their highlight in this time. The medieval period. Historical prose saga. Developed in Iceland, it was used by the author in attempting an imaginative reconstruction of the past and organized the subject matter according to a certain aesthetic principles. At the beginning of the 13th century, Sentimental romances with an adventurous or pseudo-historical contribution of this period is John Wycliffe's translation of the Bible in English. The most gifted was the poet Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote, among other great works, the Canterbury Tales. The Renaissance period. The Renaissance occurred from the early 14th century to the late 16th century. The Renaissance was a time of great beauty and art. It was also a time of creativity, imagination, and curiosity. The word Renaissance is a French word which means rebirth. The Renaissance type of poetry began in Italy and France. The verse forms was brought to England by Sir Thomas Wyatt. The model and inspiration for this new poetry was the Italian Petrarch. The Restoration period. Restoration literature is an English literature written after the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 following the period of the Commonwealth. The three leading Spanish writers of 17th century was Cervantes, Lope de Vega, and Caldera. Works of Cervantes includes the Don Quixote. On the other hand, works of Lope de Vega includes El Isidro, and the works of Calderon includes Life is a Dream. French literature of the 17th century is marked by good papers of the French court and culture. Period of Classicism. This is a movement that can be defined by its attention to traditional forms, concentrating on elegance and symmetry. Historians often identify the rise of Romanticism with the Industrial Revolution, or the American War of Independence. During these years, Spanish colonies won their independence from Spain and started life as free nations. Because of this, much of the literature was political in nature. Most European writers wrote in a way that is called classicism. When writers or artists of any sort follows a popular style, we say they belong to the school or movement. Classicism is a type of writing that shows restraint, careful planning, and a deep respect for the past. The foremost Latin literary figure of the Revolutionary period was Andreas Bello, who did a great deal for education and literature. At about this time, in the Philippines, literary works on love of country flourished. In the Philippines, notable were Jose Rizal, Emilio Jacinto, Graciano Lopez Jaena, and Marcelo del Pilar. The Romantic period. Romanticism was an artifact, literary, musical, and intellectual movement that originated in Europe toward the end of the 18th century. In this period, the writer expresses his feelings. He is imaginative, adventurous, and sentimental. Romantic writing is different from orderly, logical, and restrained writing of the classicists. Writers in many places of the world were looking to Europe for that models. Works of Victor Hugo, the giant of the Romantic movement, Lord Byron, Chateaubriand, Charles Dickens, and Spanish models were being imitated. Period of Realism. Broadly defined as a faithful representation of reality. The term realism may be loosely applied to any writing that seeks to portray life exactly as it is, without embellishment or idealization. In a more restricted sense, it is applied to the style of such novelists as Gustave Flaubert, in opposition both to Romanticism and Naturalism. Other writers of note in this movement are Björnson, Anderson, and Chekhov. Contemporary period. The literature of the contemporary period not only refers to a quality or style of writing, but also to poetry and prose, which includes works of fiction such as novels, novellas, essays, and dramatic works. Books like The Hunger Games, Harry Potter, and all the books that you see today in the library or even in the book sale are all from contemporary period. The most noteworthy item appearance on this era is called the weblog, which is used by most people on social media nowadays. The contemporary period is still improving today. We can tell how much more it will become and how much advanced it will be in the future. This is all the 8 periods of literature. I hope you enjoyed. I'm John Christopher I. Romero, signing.
So thank you for this timeline of literature. So let's go back to our so that is for our week 14 lesson. So to further know more about our week 14 lesson, kindly refer to your handouts or PDF files. But I'm pretty sure that the video that we have presented in our discussion had explained already the timeline of literature. So for your activity, we only have activity 1. So identify who are the authors of the following literary pieces. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. So this is for week 14 once again. So thank you everyone. And I will share Bible verse from the book of Mark chapter 9 verse 23. Said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. So thank you and see you on week 15.